You read people like you read the earth.
I had to. My people don't get second chances. We only get escape routes.
Loner rancher rescued an Apache girl marked as a killer, then the frontier turned into a war zone. Blackwood Creek, 1876. They tied a noose around her neck before even asking her name. In the lawless dust of Blackwood Creek, justice wasn't blind. It was blindfolded and drunk on hate. They didn't want the truth. They wanted blood. And when a woman named Solène Riviere, half Cheyenne, half French, half starved, half conscious, but still standing, was dragged into the center of town, nobody cared why. She was native, that was enough. A gallows built in hours. A crowd screaming for a name to blame. Children throwing rocks as if cruelty were a game taught at birth. A sheriff with hands too weak to hold the law, and a preacher too scared to speak. They said she killed a white man, but there was no trial, no witness, no proof, only a rope and rage. And then came a sound no one expected. The clink of metal against wood. A silver bar dropped at her feet by a man named Jaden Westward. Not to buy her freedom, but to buy their silence, long enough for the truth to claw its way out. And what followed broke the town in half. Before we dive in, if you believe justice should never be decided by a mob, comment truth below. And if you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. No one saw it coming. When Jaden Westward dropped that silver bar at the base of the gallows, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They just stared. Because in a place where blood was cheap, he had paid in something they all worshipped: wealth. But this wasn't about coin. This was about conscience. The sheriff, Hank, looked at Jaden like he'd seen a ghost. Solène's eyes, once steeled in silent defiance, flickered for the first time not in fear, but in disbelief. And in that moment, something ancient stirred in the hearts of the people, the terrifying realization that maybe they were wrong. Wrong to assume, wrong to hate, wrong to be silent. The silence didn't last. Jedediah Callahan, cattle boss and ex-soldier, spat into the dirt. You think your silver buys truth, Westward? She's a savage. And you? You're just a lonely fool with a guilty conscience. Jaden didn't blink. Then prove she's guilty, he said, or shut your damn mouth. The crowd gasped. But it wasn't the insult. It was the weight behind the words. Because Jaden wasn't just some ranch hand. He was a war veteran. A man who had lost a wife and child to a raid, one everyone blamed on her kind. Yet here he was, putting everything on the line to stop the very thing that had taken his family from him. That confused them. That angered Callahan. She killed Thomas Langdon, Callahan roared. His boy saw the raiders. You going to ignore a white child's word? Jaden stepped forward. Where's the boy? The sheriff hesitated. Out on the claim. Hasn't spoken since the funeral. Then he hasn't said anything, Jaden replied. And yet, we're ready to kill. Oh. Suddenly, a sharp voice cracked the air. I saw what happened. Heads turned. A boy, barefoot, sunburnt, with sweat-matted hair, stepped from the edge of the crowd. In his hands was a blood-stained scrap of blue cloth. My name's Elias Langdon, he said, and she didn't kill my father. The square fell silent. A 12-year-old had just undone an entire town's justification for murder. Callahan snarled. You're confused, boy. Traumatized. But Elias stood tall, his thin chest heaving. I saw the men. They were white. One had a limp. Another had a scar on his hand like a crescent moon. They weren't natives. And she found me after. I was bleeding. I was crying. And she helped me. Uneasy murmurs rippled. A pastor stepped forward, then stopped. A woman pressed her hands over her mouth. One of the shopkeepers lowered his rifle. Jaden's voice carried. She helped your son. She helped your town by not letting the real murderers vanish into the dark. And yet, here she stands, tied like livestock. If that doesn't twist your gut, then maybe you're the problem. Still, Callahan refused to bend. This is a show. It's staged. You really going to let a child rewrite the law? No, said Jaden, but I'll let him rewrite the truth. He stepped onto the gallows platform, pulled a knife from his belt, and cut the rope from Solène's wrists. This isn't justice. This is cowardice wearing a badge. Sheriff Hank, drenched in sweat, finally croaked, "We'll postpone the execution." Hear her sighed, but it was too late for neutrality. The crowd had tasted doubt, and when truth walks in, lies start to rot in the Sunday. It wasn't the sheriff who moved first. It was Doc Marin, the town's only physician, scar above his brow, black leather bag slung over his shoulder. Until now, he'd been the quietest observer. "We're about to take a life," he said calmly, "and we're relying on hearsay, not evidence. If that's justice, then we're all murderers waiting our turn." The words stung sharper than a whip. The mob that had thirsted for a hanging shifted like schoolchildren caught cheating. Some looked at Solène, her throat raw against the noose, her shoulders trembling, and saw for the first time not an enemy, but a human being. But not Callahan. His voice cracked like thunder. "You really trust her? Her people raided our lands, burned farms, butchered our kin. You think a story from a kid and a doctor clears her name?" Solène didn't flinch. At last, she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the dust like a knife. "I was 50 miles from here when Thomas Langdon died. My cousin, Pale Willow, was sick with fever. I treated her with root water and crushed willow bark. I can name every plant, every place, every hour." Doc Marin nodded slowly. "That's how you treat yellow fever." She didn't hesitate. "If this is a lie, it's one better than most doctors can conjure." Still, the noose clung to her like a curse. Hate had become a habit. Then a whisper rose, then a gasp, and then Elias Langdon stepped forward again, trembling but fierce. He held up the blue scrap of cloth, blood-crusted. "One of the men who killed my pa wore this," he said, voice breaking. "She didn't kill him, she saved me." Callahan's face twisted. He jabbed a finger at the boy. "You calling me a liar?" Elias's voice didn't waver. "No, sir, I'm calling you afraid of the truth." And just like that, a 12-year-old had split Blackwood Creek wide open with a voice louder than any gunshot. The decision wasn't made with a speech. It was made in silence. No gavel struck. No preacher blessed it. Just a town choking on shame and too proud to say sorry. But they didn't stop Jaden Westward when he untied Solène's wrists. They didn't protest when Elias stepped between her and the noose. And they didn't lift a finger when Doc Marin threw the rope into the dirt like it had never meant a damn thing. So when Jaden turned to Sheriff Hank and said, "We're not done," no one argued. That same afternoon, while the dust still hung in the air like judgment, Jaden saddled up. Elias was already waiting at the hitching post, his father's rifle strapped across his back, too large for his frame, but steady in his hands. Solène came last, silent as always, but with a purpose that made even the wind shift. Her dark hair, loosened by the struggle, framed her face like black fire. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a storm walking. They left Blackwood Creek as the sun fell behind the canyon rim, riding into the Badlands with nothing but a child's memory, a torn piece of cloth, and a rage that had finally found direction. 3 riders, 3 names, 1 purpose. The trail was thin as smoke, but they tracked it by signs the average eye would miss. Burnt matches buried under brush, boot prints dragging through the sand, a shattered coffee tin still warm when they found it near a dry creek bed. Solène crouched, her hands brushing the bent grass, her voice soft but certain. "They limped through here. One of them drags his left leg. The one with the crescent scar carries more weight in his right boot. That one's dominant." Jaden looked at her, struck by the clarity in her tone. "You read people like you read the earth." "I had to," she said without looking up. "My people don't get second chances. We only get escape routes." That line lingered in Jaden's chest like a bullet. Not just because of its truth, but because it was the first time he realized she wasn't just trying to prove her innocence. She was hunting something too. Maybe justice. Maybe ghosts. Maybe both. By twilight, they found the camp. 3 men. A small fire. Laughing, drinking, passing a dented tin of beans like it was a feast. None of them had any idea they were being watched. Their rifles leaned against a log, not in reach. Their guard was down. They thought they were free. They think the town hanged me," Solène said quietly, watching from the ridge. "That's their mistake." She wanted to go in alone. Said they'd see her as a prize, not a threat. Said it would buy time. Jaden hated the idea. But Elias only clutched the rifle tighter, his boyish knuckles white as bone. "I won't run," Solène whispered. "I survived a noose. I'm not afraid of 3 cowards." So they let her go. She rode down slow, calm, deliberate like smoke drifting through wind. The outlaws straightened, watching her with disbelief. The one with the crescent scar tilted his head. "I thought we were done with you," he said, voice oily. Solène raised her hands, palms bare. "I need water." "No." They laughed. The fat one stood, limping, his shadow quivering in the firelight. "You want water? You trade. What have you got?" Her eyes never wavered. "Mercy." That was the last thing they heard before the knife flashed. In one clean motion she cut deep across the scarred man's arm. His scream cracked the canyon like thunder. Then a shot rang out from the ridge. Jaden's rifle roared, tearing through the shoulder of the second man. He spun, collapsing in the dirt. The third turned to run, but Elias was already sliding down the rocks, rifle locked in his shaking hand. "Stop!" the boy shouted, his voice higher than the crack of the fire. The outlaw froze, grinning with blood in his teeth. "You ain't going to shoot." Elias's chest rose and fell like a storm sea. "I don't have to, but I will." And for the first time since his father's death, he didn't blink. They tied the outlaws up with ropes stolen from their own bags, found silverware, medicine tins, even a map. Circles drawn in red ink marked Blackwood Creek, with a list of ranches underneath. Jaden's hands trembled as he read the names. Some were friends. Some were the very people who had nearly hung Solène. His throat tightened. "They planned to burn the whole valley," he muttered, "and pin it on the natives." Solène didn't gasp, didn't curse. She just sat down across from the scarred man, her gaze burning through him like a brand. "You were going to kill a child's father. Blame me. Ride on like it was nothing." The man sneered, lips cracked. "We've done worse." Her knife pressed against his throat, steady as stone. "Not today." They rode back before dawn. Jaden led, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the paling sky. Elias rode in the middle, rifle across his lap, eyes hollow but fierce. Solène came last, her head held high for the first time, her spine unbroken. The outlaws, bruised and bloodied, were tied to their own saddles. When they reached the edge of Blackwood Creek, the town was awake. Doors creaked open, curtains twitched, men stared, women gasped, children clung to skirts, horses stomped nervously, sensing the tension. The bell above the church gave a single hollow ring, though no service was called. It was simply the sound of steel on steel as the wind struck it. The 3 riders entered like ghosts from another world. The woman they had nearly hanged was the one who brought justice home. The boy whose grief they pitied was now standing taller than half their men, and the rancher they trusted to stay quiet had come back with truth burning in his hand. Sheriff Hank met them in the square, his boots dragging as though the earth itself weighed him down. His face was pale, his eyes refusing to meet Solène's. His hands trembled when Jaden dropped the map and list of names at his boots. "You owe her more than an apology," Jaden said, his voice carrying across the square. Hank swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing. "I know." Around them, murmurs rippled. A shopkeeper lowered his head, shame written in the set of his jaw. The preacher stepped forward, lips moving as if to pray, then stopped, silenced by guilt. A mother pulled her child behind her skirts, as though hiding her would erase what the town had nearly done. Solène said nothing. She reached into her satchel, pulled out the noose they had tied around her neck, and let it fall at Hank's feet. The rope hit the dust with a sound heavier than iron. "No more of this," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. "Not for me, not for anyone." Silence held the square. But it was not the coward silence of the night before. It was the silence of a people forced to see themselves in a mirror of dust and blood. Children shifted, eyes wide. A blacksmith crossed his arms, shame burning red across his cheeks. The barber closed his shop door, unwilling to meet the gaze of a woman he had once jeered at. Even the dogs in the street seemed to sense the weight, tails low, ears flattened. For the first time, the townsfolk weren't looking at her as an outsider. They were looking at themselves, at the gallows they had built, at the rope that had nearly turned them into murderers. Jaden's hand hovered near Solène's shoulder, not touching, but close enough that she felt it like warmth through the chill. Elias stood straighter, as if daring anyone to challenge what they had brought back. And as the sun rose over Blackwood Creek, painting the dust in gold light, justice, fragile, imperfect, but undeniable, finally breathed. And if that moment shook you, imagine what happens next. Comment justice below if you're still reading. Subscribe if you believe silence can be as deadly as a bullet. And if this made your chest tighten, drop a like because the road ahead only gets darker. They didn't speak of forgiveness on the way back. The road from the canyon to Blackwood Creek was long and crooked, flanked by brittle sage, jagged rocks, and the ghosts of things buried too deep to name. Dust rose beneath the hooves of their tired horses, coating skin and tongue with grit. The wind carried the dry rattle of grasshoppers and the distant cry of a hawk circling above, as if even the sky was watching. Jaden rode ahead, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the trail like it might split open without warning. He hadn't spoken since the campfire fight, jaw clenched so hard the muscles twitched under his skin. Elias rode behind him, close to the outlaw's horse, his father's rifle strapped across his back. The weapon was far too large for a boy his age, but his grip on it was steady, almost frightening in its determination. But it was Solène who kept the real watch. She rode last, her dark eyes scanning every ridge and hollow. Her silence wasn't peace, it was vigilance, sharpened by years of being hunted. Every rustle of brush, every shifting shadow, was measured. She didn't let herself relax, not when survival had never once been gifted, only earned. By late morning, the town emerged on the horizon like a scar across the land. Smoke from chimneys curled into the pale sky. The bell tower of the small church stood stiff against the wind. People saw them coming before they even reached the first fence line. 3 riders, 3 prisoners tied to their own saddles, and a silence heavier than any funeral procession. Shopkeepers stepped out of their doors, dusting flour or sawdust from their hands. Mothers pulled their children close. A drunk staggered out of the saloon, sobered at once by the sight. The same hands that had thrown rocks at Solène only a day earlier now gripped hat brims in nervous shame. They rode straight into the square, into the very dirt where she had nearly died. Sheriff Hank stood waiting, sweat already beading under his collar. His hat drooped in his trembling hands. When Jaden tossed the stolen map and folded list to his boots, Hank bent down with shaking fingers. His eyes scanned the names, and his breath hitched his own brother-in-law among them. They were going to burn Blackwood Creek, Jaden said, voice low but carrying, and the next town after. Blame it all on the natives. No one answered, because the truth weighed too much to deny. Solène swung down from her horse. Her boots hit the ground softly, but the sound made the whole square flinch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't accuse. She reached into her saddlebag, pulled out the noose that had nearly ended her life, and dropped it in the dirt. The coil of rope lay like a dead snake at Hank's feet. No more of this, she said. Her tone wasn't a plea, it was a verdict, and no one dared object. But silence broke from the far end of the crowd. Jed Callahan shoved forward, his face crimson, his voice already trembling with fury. So that's it? We forget what they've done, what we've lost. His arm swung, not toward the captured outlaws, but at Solène, like she was still the only enemy that mattered. My brother's dead, Callahan barked. My farm burned. My wife wakes screaming every night, and you let her walk in here like a hero. She saved your town, Jaden said, calm but with steel beneath it. She's still one of them, Callahan spat. Solène turned her gaze on him. Her eyes were steady, her voice quiet, but it cut sharper than any knife. And what are you, Jed? You watched a boy stand in front of a gallows, and you still wanted to pull the lever. You saw truth, and you clung to rage. So tell me, what does that make you? The crowd held its breath. Callahan's jaw twitched. His hand hovered above the revolver at his hip. For one terrifying second, it seemed the square would drown in blood again. But someone moved faster. A woman in black stepped between them. Middle-aged, her face hollow with grief, carved deeper than any canyon. Clara DeWitt. She had buried her son 2 years ago after a raid. Her husband lost a leg to the same fire. Her sorrow had been silent, invisible until now. "You think I don't mourn, Jed?" she said softly. "You think I haven't cursed the dark every night for what we lost? I prayed for justice. But this," she pointed to the rope at their feet, "this is just another way to bury the truth." "Oh." Her gaze shifted, lingering on Solène, then softening as it rested on Elias. "I saw my son in you," she whispered to the boy, tears filling her eyes, "and I saw my shame in all of us." And then she did what no one else in Blackwood Creek had dared. Clara walked to the prisoners. Her hands trembled, but she untied them one by one, cut the bindings, pulled them down from their horses. She marched them across the square and shoved them into the jailhouse herself. Sheriff Hank trailed behind her, silent and pale, as though his authority had finally been claimed by someone braver. The townsfolk watched, stunned. No cheering, no jeers, just faces hollowed by realization. The blacksmith lowered his hammer, shame burning red across his cheeks. The preacher bowed his head, words of prayer dying in his throat. A child tugged at her mother's dress and whispered, "Mama, why'd we hurt her?" When it was done, Solène lifted her eyes to the clock tower. The hands pointed straight to noon, the very hour she had been meant to die. And yet here she stood, not because of the law, because truth had clawed its way back into the light. Jaden turned to Hank. "There's more," he said. "Names on that list. Some of them live right here in this town, in that council." A murmur rippled like dry brush catching fire. Hank's lips trembled. "You sure?" Jaden nodded grimly. "They didn't just try to kill her. They tried to destroy this town from the inside out." "Oh." Eyes darted across the square. Suspicion bloomed. The banker's office was locked, though it should have been open. Councilman Dorn had left that very morning. The mayor was absent entirely. The crowd stirred, restless, fearful. "It's not over," Solène said quietly, her voice carrying like the desert wind. "Justice doesn't stop because one rope falls. There are others." She turned to Elias. The boy had not spoken, but his eyes were set like flint. "You still want to come?" she asked. He nodded. His small hand clenched tighter on the rifle strap. "I won't stop until it's finished." Jaden looked between them. His shoulders sagged with the weight of battles long past, but his voice rang firm. "Then we ride again." The square seemed to exhale, a sound of shame and fear tangled together. The sunlight bore down mercilessly, gilding every guilty face. And for the first time, Blackwood Creek realized its innocence was gone forever. And as the sun climbed higher above Blackwood Creek, the gallows still stood in the square, but now empty. The beams creaked in the noon wind, the rope swaying like a phantom. It was no longer a symbol of justice, but of shame, a reminder of how close the town had come to becoming its own executioner. And yet it also stood for something else. 3 people, once strangers, who had walked through fire and emerged as something bound tighter than blood. That night, there was no rest. Blackwood Creek slept in the uneasy silence of a town that had nearly condemned the wrong soul. Doors were locked, shutters drawn, lamps dimmed low. But on the edge of town, at Jaden Westward's ranch house, a different kind of stillness took hold. Jaden stood on his porch, hat in hand, the boards creaking under his boots. The moon was high, washing the land in silver. He stared out across the open prairie, like he was waiting for it to speak, or perhaps for ghosts to step out of the shadows. The house behind him, once built for a wife and child buried too soon, carried new sounds he hadn't heard in years: footsteps, hushed voices, the scrape of a knife against a cutting board. Inside, Solène moved quietly through the kitchen. Her sleeves were rolled high, hair falling loose over her shoulders. The same blade that had cut a man's flesh now chopped carrots into a cast-iron pot. The firelight caught the rope burns on her wrists, the bruises at her throat, but it also caught the grace in her movements. She didn't cook to impress. She cooked because survival was sacred. Across the table sat Elias, his face pale but steady. He was cleaning his father's rifle, oiling the wood, running a cloth along the steel. The weapon was heavy, awkward in his hands, but he worked with a concentration that made him seem far older than 12. His small shoulders hunched, but his eyes never wavered. For a moment, Jaden lingered at the doorway, taking it in. The kitchen smelled of carrots and smoke, of iron and earth. His wife had once cooked in that same pot. His daughter had once sat in that same chair where Elias now Saturday. The ache in his chest tightened, but something else pushed through the grief, something warm, fragile, frightening in its hope. He set his hat down, crossed the room, and sat with them. No one spoke, but words weren't needed. A kind of belonging filled the space, unspoken but undeniable. Not family, something harder, older, forged in scars, silence, and shared fire. But outside those walls, the storm had not passed. It was circling. By dawn, whispers spread like wildfire. The councilman named on the outlaw's map had vanished. Mayor Cridgegg's house stood empty, curtains flapping, the safe cracked open and ledgers missing. Horses were gone from the barn. Banker Elwyn's records showed money wired to names no one knew, transfers made days before Solène's hanging. This had been planned long before. They weren't only going to blame the natives, they were going to erase them. Sheriff Hank, shaken but awake, called for a town hall meeting. By noon, the square filled again, this time not with bloodlust, but with reckoning. Families whispered names, trades made in back rooms, suspicious deals in the dead of night. What had been rumor hardened into evidence. The crowd was tense, ashamed, but ready to listen. Then came thunder on hooves. A horse stumbled into the square, carrying a half-dead man. Bo Riggs, the saloon drifter, the town drunk, the fool everyone ignored. Blood soaked his shirt, a bullet in his side. He tumbled from his horse, gasping. "They're coming," he rasped. Not raiders, not savages, men with badges, black coats, hired riders out of Clayoth, paid to burn it all. His words cracked, his lips split with fever. Paid to bury you. Then he collapsed in Doc Marin's arms. The square erupted. Panic tore through the crowd like a prairie fire. Women clutched children. Men scrambled for rifles. Shopkeepers ran to shutter windows. The preacher prayed out loud, voice trembling. Jaden stood firm. "We don't run," he said. His voice rolled across the square like thunder. "And we don't lynch," added Clara DeWitt. She stepped forward, black dress snapping in the wind, grief still etched in her face but no longer bending her shoulders. Behind her stood mothers, ranch hands, even the blacksmith people who had once been silent now choosing to stand. Jaden turned to Hank. "We need every able body. Deputize them. Tonight." Hank, no longer the man who shook before a rope, squared his shoulders. "I'll sign the orders, but we don't have the numbers." Solène spoke then, her voice low but carrying. "We don't need numbers. We need conviction." That night, Blackwood Creek transformed. Trenches were dug beyond the gates. Wagons and barrels were dragged into barricades. Livestock was driven to higher ground. Women filled cartridge belts. Children hauled water buckets from the well. Old men hammered boards across windows. The clang of hammers and the crack of wood echoed through the night. Doc Marin worked by lantern light, stitching Bo Riggs' wound, whispering comfort like a father. He handed out tinctures brewed from the last of his herbs, pressing bottles into calloused hands. Jaden walked the perimeter, barking orders, his voice carrying the weight of a soldier who had fought too many wars. But when his eyes found Solène, something softened. She worked in silence, sharpening blades until sparks danced in the dark. At her wrist, she tied a strip of red cloth the same shade as the boy's bloodied scrap. She whispered old words under her breath, not magic, but memory. She wasn't only preparing for a fight, she was carrying the weight of every soul who hadn't been spared. Elias stood near her, watching the stars flicker alive overhead. His voice trembled. "I'm scared." "Good," Solène said, her eyes never leaving the knife's edge. "Only fools walk into fire without fear. Fear will keep your hands awake. Fear will make you listen. It's what you do with it that counts." The boy swallowed and nodded. His grip on the rifle strap tightened, his shoulders straightening just enough to look like the man he would one day become. Overhead, the stars shone cold and endless. The night air was thick with smoke, sweat, and whispered prayers. For the first time, the town was united not by hate, but by choice. And in the center of it all, 3 figures stood together. Jaden, Solène, Elias, no longer strangers, no longer merely survivors, forged. By dawn, a black cloud approached from the east. Dust billowed high, kicked up by 20 riders in long dark coats, their guns slung low, their eyes hidden behind tinted goggles. They didn't wear sheriff stars. They didn't need to. They were the kind of men who made their own stars. Lawless mercenaries pretending to be law, the kind paid to erase entire towns and rewrite the story in someone else's handwriting. Blackwood Creek stood waiting. The barricades had been raised, wagons turned sideways, windows barred. Jaden Westward stood on one end of the street, rifle cradled in his arms, his silhouette framed by the rising Sunday. Solène waited near the water trough, knife in hand, her red cloth tied tight around her wrist. Elias crouched behind a crate of feed, his small frame hidden, his father's rifle steady across his knees. His fear was still there, but it no longer ruled him. The riders slowed as they reached the edge of town. Their horses snorted, hooves grinding against the dry earth. One in front, taller than the rest, raised a hand. His voice was deep, lazy, and cruel. "You've got something that don't belong to you," he called out. Jaden didn't flinch. "No," he said, his tone hard as granite. "We've got someone you failed to kill." The man smirked, showing teeth stained with tobacco. "Last chance, hand her over." It was Solène who stepped forward. Her voice cut through the morning air, sharper than steel. "You already tried with a rope, with lies, with men who wear masks in daylight." She walked into the center of the road, shoulders square, chin lifted. "If you want to finish what you started, come and try." Behind her, Blackwood Creek rose. Windows opened, rifles appeared, boots stomped onto porches. Mothers clutched pitchforks, shopkeepers hefted hammers, ranchers cocked their shotguns, trembling hands, but steady hearts. For once, silence did not mean fear, it meant readiness. The lead rider scanned the faces. What he saw was not terror, but fury that had finally learned to stand upright. And in that moment, he understood. They hadn't saved Solène Riviere. She had saved them, and Blackwood Creek would never kneel again. The battle, when it came, was not a massacre, but a reckoning. The riders charged, their horses pounding down the street like thunder rolling across the plains. Gunfire cracked, windows shattered. The church bell swung wild, ringing without a hand to pull its rope. Jaden fired first. With the precision of a soldier who had lost too much to miss, he disabled 3 horses in 3 shots. The animals stumbled, crashing into one another, throwing riders into the dust. His movements were deliberate, practiced, each pull of the trigger echoing finality. Solène moved like a phantom. She slipped between shadows, her knife flashing in arcs of silver. She wasn't fighting to kill, she was fighting to disrupt, to unbalance, to draw fear into the eyes of men who had never faced anyone who stood their ground. Her voice rose once, a cry in her Cheyenne tongue, ancient and defiant. The townsfolk answered not with words but with action, rallying as if her courage had passed into their bones. Elias pressed his cheek to the rifle's stock, breath steady. He fired once, and the recoil nearly toppled him, but the bullet struck true, grazing a rider's arm and spinning him off balance. The boy didn't celebrate. He reloaded, jaw clenched, ready for the next. The townsfolk, guided by Solène's presence, fought like people who had finally found their purpose. They weren't fighting for revenge. They were fighting for their very souls, for the future they had almost lost to their own silence. The mercenaries faltered. They were used to terrorizing scattered, frightened people, not a town that had chosen to stand as one. Shots cracked from porches, arrows of fury disguised as nails and pitchforks thrust from alleys. Smoke filled the street, horses screamed, and still the townsfolk held their line. Jaden advanced down the main road, his rifle steady. Solène moved beside him, knife and shadow. Elias followed, crouched low but fearless, and together they pushed the mercenaries back. One rider fell, then another. The rest, realizing they were outmatched not by firepower but by spirit, broke formation. They turned, spurring their horses, retreating east with a trail of dust and defeat behind them. The echo of hooves faded into the horizon. When silence fell, it was a new kind of silence. Not the silence of fear, but of triumph and hard-won introspection. Blackwood Creek stood scarred but not broken. Smoke curled from shattered windows, blood stained the dirt, but the gallows loomed over it all, empty. It had become something else, not a tool of death, but a monument to shame overcome. The townsfolk looked at Solène not with suspicion but with gratitude, quiet, reverent, unspoken. Mothers lowered their weapons and bowed their heads. Men who had once cursed her now tipped their hats. Even Sheriff Hank, battered and ash-faced, stepped forward. His voice cracked when he said, "We owe you more than we can ever pay." Jaden felt something shift inside him. For years, his soul had been a battlefield of grief, haunted by the wife and child he lost. But now, standing with the smell of gunpowder still in his lungs and victory humming in his blood, he felt peace. The ghosts did not vanish, but they finally stepped back, allowing something else to grow, a quiet sense of purpose fulfilled. But Solène did not stay. Her justice was not to be found in the walls of a town that had once tied a rope around her neck. She had healed Blackwood Creek, yes, but her path was her own, and it stretched west. Toward the setting Sunday, she gave Jaden a gentle nod, her dark eyes holding his just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. She touched Elias's shoulder, soft and firm, a blessing and a farewell. Then she mounted her horse. Jaden watched her go, his heart heavy yet strangely light. It wasn't sorrow that burned in his chest, it was understanding. Some souls were not meant to be kept. Some were meant to be free. Solène rode west, her silhouette cutting against the crimson horizon, a figure of strength, of healing, of defiance, a living testament that survival could become grace, and grace could become freedom. A true Wild West love story of self-discovery and endurance. Elias stood beside Jaden, no longer defined by grief. His small hand rested steady on his father's rifle, no tremor left. He was still a boy, but one who had faced death and chosen to live. A boy who now understood courage, not as the absence of fear, but as standing anyway. The road was long, and for Jaden and Elias, the journey had only begun. Together they turned from the gallows and faced the open horizon. The plains stretched endless before them, golden in the light of a sinking Sunday. It was not a promise of ease. It was a promise of truth, of adventure, of healing, of a future earned. For Jaden, it was no longer about ghosts. For Elias, no longer about loss. And for Solène, wherever she rode, it was about freedom. Together or apart, their stories had intertwined. And in that bond lay something deeper than romance, deeper than blood. A Wild West love that endured as memory and legend, and would one day be told among countless cowboy love stories. The sun dipped low, bathing the world in amber light. The air smelled of dust and smoke, of endings and beginnings. And Blackwood Creek, though scarred, stood taller than it ever had before. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comment. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment AMEN below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.